And welcome to a pop-up Hoon on the official cash rate change and also what's happening in the housing market at the moment to Ganesh Nana, the former Productivity Commission chair, well-known economist and former leader at Burl. Uh, Ganesh, you've spent your entire life looking at official cash rate decisions and
Sure.
the latest forecasts on the economy and inflation and also, how the housing market's going. Today, the official cash rate was cut 50 basis points as everyone expected, and the Reserve Bank has brought forward its expectations for rate cuts well into this year from later this year. And we're now looking at maybe two or three rate cuts in the next 3 or 4 months. And I wondered, what did you think initially, therefore, about the decision today and what we're likely to see with those interest rates?
I'm Kia ora, Bernard, and thanks for having me here. And as you say, I've been spending not probably all of my life, but quite a fair amount of it looking at cash rates and commenting on these sorts of announcements that come with, unfortunately, monotonous regularity. And this is just another one where interest rates went up because they had to bring down inflation, and now inflation is back under control. Interest rates come back down, and it's it is difficult not to be cynical about these things because we forever turn ourselves upside down looking at the intricacies of the forecasts and the where the commas and the full stops are, and every time the governor um, draws a breath in his conversation, we all look into what is he really saying. This is yet another short-term response to the short-term cycle that we continue to have, the ups and downs, whether it's of the housing market or whether it's employment or whether it's inflation. And we never seem to get to the long term. And that's always the worry. And the more worrying thing is the damage we do in the short term to those long-term prospects. And undoubtedly, we've got to talk about productivity in this story, but we've also got to talk about the impact that the exchange rate interest rate cycle is having on business investment and export potential.
I was at the Waikato University Economics Forum last week, and the discussion about productivity came up, and the moderator of the discussion was Stephen Joyce, the former minister of MB, and he said to the audience, as soon as you mention productivity, voters go to sleep. And certainly the government today is very much portraying the rate cut and the expectations of more rate cuts as just the tonic the economy needs to get us going. We just needed to wait for these interest rates to be cut, and she'll be right. We'll get back on track. What's your view about whether or not that's true in any sort of long-term sense, and whether actually maybe some changes need to be made
Well,
to the actual machine rather than just changing the amount of fuel going in?
Well, we're doing exactly the same thing we've done sort of 3 or 4 times, or probably even more over the past couple of decades. It's the cycle. Interest rates go up when there's inflation shock, and then when we're past that shock, it comes and interest rates come down again. Rah rah, we're back on track for growth, and that's the critical thing. Growth is not productivity. We get GDP up, that's growth, but it doesn't actually add or improve our productivity, our ability to generate good incomes, get away from minimum wage jobs, our ability to put in first class infrastructure, whether that's Dunedin Hospital or a new ferry terminal down in Picton, or ferries to hitch up to those new ferry terminals. We never get to that. So yes, we're back on. And every time a government is fortunate enough to be at a cycle where there's interest rates cuts, of course they're going to celebrate. But unfortunately, as night follows day and a day follow night, there will be yet another interest rate increase into the future because there will be an inflation shock. And you just need to read the words in the Reserve Bank document. There's a lot of ifs and buts, and it's basically saying, well, we're okay for this part of the cycle, and hopefully we're past the worst of this cycle. But lo and behold, there'll be another cycle ahead whether it's 6 months or 12 months, or maybe if we're fortunate, maybe a couple of years. But we continue down the cycle. Throughout the cycle, nobody's actually focusing on whether it be productivity, whether it's delivering those high wage jobs that we all yearn for, or dare I say, to stop our kids going to Australia and beyond. Training our doctors, training our nurses, our teachers, all of those sorts of things gets shunted to the long term, and we don't tackle those because we're so focused on the cycle. And yes, yeah, let's celebrate interest rates coming down, but we should be now focusing on what do we have to do to be better prepared for that next cycle, so that interest rates don't have to go up so much. And unfortunately, and this is where everybody goes to sleep, that does require investment in, whether you call it productivity or whether it calls it new stuff that's going to lift ourselves out of this volume-based growth that we are forever trapped into. And for those with a bit of a memory, Paul Callahan wrote a book a while ago called From Wool to Wetter, all about moving us away from volume-based growth towards the techie stuff, all the clever, innovative stuff that we've always been talking about. And that book, if I recall, was written in 2008. And it's a bit dated now, but the messages are still the same. When are we going to get away from this volume-based, tourism? A prime example of the announcement a couple of days ago, all based on volume growth. When are we going to get to that value growth, that productivity that gives us high wage jobs in tourism rather than reliant on minimum wage labour? It's not an easy solution.
Yeah,
But
just
relying on interest rates to get us there is not going to do it.
yeah, because the government's really seeing the interest rate cuts as a key part of their growth plan, so to speak, and they've really framed their actions over the last year of planning to cut the size of government as a percentage of the economy, restraining growth and spending on health, stopping the building of significant numbers of new houses with Kāinga Ora freezing, and then restarting some of the house building that was going on, stopping the planning of hospitals, which we now know was responsible last year for the loss of more than 10,000 jobs in construction, on top of the 8 to 10,000 jobs lost in the public sector. The government has said, right, the best thing we can do for the economy is to cut the deficit, get the government borrowing down. This will create space for the public sector, for the private sector to come forward, and for businesses to invest and households to spend and invest. And that's the best possible thing we can do. We need to reduce the amount of government investment in infrastructure, government spending on health and various other things, and let the private sector come forward and step into the gap. We don't want to be crowding out the private sector. What's your view on that sort of framing of the issue?
It sounds nice, and it's we could all point to the textbook it comes from. It comes from a range of textbooks, but they sound wonderful, and if only it were true, we would have got there already, because we've tried it before, and that's the frustration for people like myself who have that. We've tried it before more than a couple of times, and we can all point fingers, but the private sector doesn't step in for lots of reasons, because the private sector suddenly realizes it's lost its workforce. So how can it possibly step in? Because the workforce has disappeared. Okay, we've got to train the workforce. That requires time, by which time interest rates would have gone back up again because there'd been another shock. We don't have that long-term perspective to enable, whether it be the private or the public sector, to step in, to build that infrastructure, to do that, those wonderful innovative stuff, to build the innovative ecosystem or the techie stuff, and to move from that volume-based economy to value-based. We haven't got the time, or the private sector has shown over many cycles that they won't step in, or don't step in, for lots of reasons. And I would argue, and I'm not criticising the private sector, it's a rational behaviour. They don't see demand. They've lost workforce. They're not interested in training workforce because it takes time, whether it be doctors, nurses or teachers, or whether it be the scientists. It takes time to train them, by which time there's a whole lot of other shocks coming at them. That's where the public sector needs to fulfill its role, to be that long-term investor, to do the training, whether it be the workforce, whether it be for workforce for businesses, whether it be the workforce for the health sector or the education sector or the science sector or engineering and infrastructure. There's a lot around that workforce requirements for training, especially in the workforce that we've got now, which is a globally mobile workforce. So we can all, um, you know, slap ourselves on the back and be more worried about all the people leaving. But that's a reality. It's up to us to make it attractive for our kids to stay here. You know, what is the vision? What sort of country do they want to stay in? And also make it attractive for others to come here as well. That requires long-term, you know, I hate to use the word visioning, but some sort of long-term strategy, or you could call it hope, but a plan to say it's not just a public sector is not going to step out private and to leave it to someone else. Public sector is going to play a proactive role to encourage the private sector to come in. Here's the foundation. Yes, we've got the Reserve Bank looking after inflation, but we need, if you like, fiscal policy, or we need a public sector. I won't say to look after, to provide that platform for, in particular, workforce training, but also our industrial relations and our labour laws, and so we're not exploiting labour. We've got to have those in place. We've got to have competition laws so that a monopoly in a particular sector can't crowd out all those small businesses that want to come in and do things innovatively, which we all know the big guys are not very innovative, especially if they've got a monopoly and got no incentive to innovate. All of those things requires an active public sector alongside a private sector. It's not an either or. And to pretend that when we just public sector just withdraws and somehow miraculously the private sector is going to step in is what's the word? It's the story of the wonderful fable that we can read our kids bedtime stories and they all love them, but the reality is not the bedtime story. And that's not a critique of the private sector. It's just realistic. And we've had the evidence from past that we've got to stop pretending that the past is, that we can't learn from the past. And we've definitely got to stop pretending that this time it's going to be different. We've always been told this time it's going to be different. Well, actually, it's never different unless you understand the fundamentals of the New Zealand economy, which is built on people. We can't continue to build on commodities. We know where we have to go. We just have to do that hard yards.
Yeah, just thinking about stories. You mentioned bedtime stories. You know, often politicians, economists have to get messages across and do things by telling stories. That's how we learn about what's going on. We need a character. We need an arc. We need an idea that seems to trigger in our brain understanding. And one of the really interesting things about this debate at the moment is that the government is portraying itself as just like a household, just like a housewife or a house husband who has to balance the books at the end of every month and needs to tighten their belts when things are tough. And a government is just like a household. As a macroeconomist, can you tell us about, you know, whether that's true and whether that story is real or a fable?
It's a fable. It's an incredibly damaging story to frame the government as another household. It's wrong, full stop, from a macroeconomist perspective, for lots of reasons that we probably haven't got time to go into. But critically, it's that argument out. It's driven from that argument that you had before about the public sector and the private sector are busy fighting for the same resource, and somebody's got to step away for the private sector to come in. It doesn't work that way. It requires both the public sector and the private sector to travel in unison and parallel alongside each other, because they've each got jobs to do. The big thing with the government that the private sector doesn't have is the government doesn't have a strong constraint on its financials. It can manage its finances, and definitely within New Zealand, the government has ample room to spend, whether it be on infrastructure or doctors or nurses or teachers. It has ample, or superannuitants like myself, or children, all of those things. So it is not as constrained as it would like to portray. It is just a fable that it wants to send out there for its own reasons, and I don't know what those reasons are, but it doesn't help with that narrative, actually, that actually, hey guys, the government is here to help you. We are here to stand by private sector businesses. We want you to be innovative. If you fail, we're here to catch you. We won't let you fall over badly. But we want, if you fail, we want you to learn from those failures and carry on being innovative, to take risks. By definition, some people who take risks will fail, but here is the government or the public sector or the community here to catch you and put you back on your feet and continue on. That is the framing, if you like, of a government in terms of its role to protect and encourage the community and all the businesses and the workers to work together towards that goal of not growth, but towards that goal of, yes, productivity. But if you want to talk, don't like that word, let's talk about high wages. Let's talk about high wage, well-paying jobs. We don't get it by one person taking themselves off the field and say, it's all up to you guys, we're not interested. That's the government, in my opinion, the public sector, call it what you like, withdrawing and not playing its role. Abdicating its responsibilities was the phrase I was after. And I don't like, and it's not good having a government that's such a big part of the New Zealand economy abdicating its responsibilities, because the private sector is definitely not interested in those responsibilities of looking.
Yeah, and research from the IMF and the OECD of austerity programs over the last 15 years or so since the global financial crisis show very clearly that, you know, for every 1 percentage point of tightening of fiscal policy, it destroys GDP output consumption by well more than 1%, and actually increases the debt to GDP load simply because of the contraction in GDP.
Absolutely. And even
Ganesh,
worse, it impacts on that social contract that we believe, you know, governments are now seen as, okay, they're not going to save us. But by the way, they bailed out all those banks and everything else. So actually, and it's that social contract that us economists and definitely business people have to be paying a lot more attention to now in this world where things are, we're not entirely sure where things are heading. That social contract, that sense of collective social cohesion is something that I think we need to pay a lot more attention to.
yeah, it's interesting. This weekend, there's going to be elections in Germany where they have the most extreme debates about the so-called debt brake, and which they still haven't resolved to, you know, get rid of it. And one of the reasons it's quite likely there could be a neo-Nazi party in some form in the government in Germany after the weekend is because of this obsession with sticking to their debt brake, what we'd call a debt limit of less than a certain percentage point of GDP. Ganesh Nana, thank you very much for coming on to the show. Independent economist, former Productivity Commission Chair Ganesh Nana. Great to have a chat about the economy, interest rates, and life at the universe and everything. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, Bernard. Pleasure.
Cheers. Aminu. Right, so I'm just stopping there. So the live stream has stopped. We are now uploaded.